He had already decided what Chris was, someone who could be pushed down onto that cake and laughed at, someone whose face in frosting was worth more as a video than as a person standing in front of 200 people, and that decision felt so obvious to him that it didn't require a second thought. What Walter didn't notice was that the napkin Chris reached for wasn't handed to him by a server rushing to help. It wasn't pulled from the stack near the gift table. It was the one folded on the corner of the head table, the one with a small crest stitched into its corner, the kind of detail that only means something if you know what you're looking at, and placed exactly where it was, because someone had once decided, personally, that it should go there. Why didn't Chris say anything, when he had every reason to? If you've ever been humiliated by someone who had no idea what they were standing in front of, this one is for you. Subscribe to the channel and stay with this. What Chris did next wasn't revenge. It was something quieter, and it outlasted the laughter in that room by a lot longer than anyone expected. I want to explain what kind of man I was before that party, because it matters. It's the reason I didn't wipe that cake off my face like a man defending himself. It's the reason I let 200 people laugh, and it's the reason I didn't need to say a single word to any of them that night. Margaret called on a Tuesday, which was already strange, because Margaret and I had not spoken on a Tuesday, or any day that wasn't logistically necessary, in almost 4 years. Our conversations since the divorce had narrowed down to the practical tax documents that still had both our names on them, a storage unit we kept meaning to empty, the occasional forwarded email about a mutual friend's move or illness. So when her name appeared on my phone on an ordinary evening, I answered it the way you answer a fire alarm you're not sure is real. Carefully. Braced. She told me she was getting engaged. She told me she wanted me there when she announced it, at a party, at a hotel, in 3 weeks. She used the word closure the way people use words they've rehearsed, smoothly, like it had already done its job somewhere else before she brought it to me. She said it would mean something if I came. She said Walter had heard so much about me and wanted to finally meet the man she used to be married to, as though that were a compliment, as though there were a version of that sentence that didn't require me to stand in a room and be examined. I said I'd think about it, which was the truthful way of saying no without saying it yet. For 2 days, I turned the invitation over, the way you turn over a stone you suspect has something living under it. I didn't need closure. I had built mine slowly, over years, out of work and routine, and the specific relief of a life that no longer required anyone else's permission to feel finished. Going to that party wouldn't give me anything I didn't already have. It would only ask me to perform having it, in front of people who had never once asked how I was doing, when it actually would have mattered. But there was a version of me, underneath the version that had learned restraint, that still wanted to know what kind of man she had chosen after me. Not out of jealousy, out of something closer to curiosity, the same instinct that makes you check the outcome of a decision you walked away from a long time ago, just to see if it turned out the way you privately hoped it wouldn't. I called her back on Thursday. I told her I would come. I told myself it was because avoiding it would have made the whole thing larger in my head than it deserved to be, and there was some truth in that. But if I'm being honest, the real reason was smaller and less flattering. I wanted to see it. I wanted to stand in the room and know, for myself, exactly what I was no longer part of. I should explain what I did with the years after Margaret, because none of what happened at that party makes sense without it. The divorce took 11 months to finalize, and about 3 years to actually recover from, in the quiet, unglamorous way most divorces get recovered from, not through some singular turning point, but through the accumulation of ordinary days, where the absence hurt a little less than the day before. I moved out of the house we'd bought together, and into an apartment above a hardware store that smelled permanently of sawdust and motor oil, and I told myself it was temporary, and it was, though not for the reasons I expected. I had been working, at the time, for a hospitality group my uncle had built and mismanaged in roughly equal measure. 6 properties, all of them tired, all of them bleeding money, in ways that were obvious to anyone who actually walked the floors instead of reading the quarterly summaries. When he passed, the responsibility landed on me, mostly by default. Nobody else in the family wanted it. It looked, from the outside, like inheriting a burden. I didn't see it that way. I saw 6 buildings that were failing for reasons I actually understood: bad staffing decisions, deferred maintenance, a brand identity that had been diluted year after year by people trying to be everything to every guest. I knew how to fix that. I'd spent a decade learning hotels from the inside, not from a boardroom, and there is a particular kind of clarity that comes from rebuilding something with your hands while your personal life is quietly falling apart. The work didn't fill the hole the divorce left, but it gave me somewhere to put my attention that wasn't grief. It took 4 years to turn the 6 properties profitable. It took 2 more to acquire the flagship, the one everyone now calls the best hotel in the country, the one where Margaret's engagement party would eventually be held, and rebuild it from a struggling mid-tier property into something people request by name a year in advance. I didn't do any of this to prove something to Margaret. I want to be honest about that, because it would be a cleaner story if I had, and clean stories are usually the ones people get wrong. What I did do, deliberately, was keep my name off of it. Not out of secrecy exactly, out of a preference for being known by the work rather than by the ownership. My name sits on legal documents and tax filings and almost nowhere else. To the people I grew up with, to Margaret, to anyone from that earlier version of my life, I was still just Chris, steady, a little quiet, doing fine, nothing remarkable. Which meant that when I walked into that ballroom for her engagement party, not one person in the room had any idea they were standing inside something I had built. Walter found me within the first 10 minutes, which told me something about how the evening was going to go before it actually went there. He had the handshake of a man who'd practiced it, firm to the point of being a small performance, and the kind of smile that arrived before he'd actually decided what he thought of you. He said he'd heard so much about me, and then didn't repeat any of it, which is usually a sign there wasn't much complimentary to repeat. He asked what I did for work, and when I told him hospitality, in the flattened, general way I tell most strangers, he nodded like I'd confirmed something he already suspected. Still in the industry, he said. Good for you. Stability's underrated. I let it sit there. I have learned, over the years, that the correct response to a comment like that is often no response at all, because people who make comments like that are usually more interested in hearing themselves make them than in hearing anything back. It continued in small increments through the evening, the way these things usually do. A comment about my truck, still driving that thing, when I'd mentioned parking it around the block. A comment about how Margaret must have been patient all those years, waiting for things to take off, delivered with a laugh that invited me to laugh along at my own expense. A comment, later, about how some men just find their ceiling early, and there's nothing wrong with that. Some real warmth in his voice, as if he were being generous by not finishing the thought. Margaret laughed at most of it, not because she found it funny, I don't think, but because laughing was easier than the alternative, and I understood that instinct better than I wanted to. I'd spent years married to a version of that same impulse, keeping a room comfortable at the cost of keeping it honest. I watched her do it now for someone else, and it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like recognizing a familiar coat on a stranger. I didn't argue with Walter. I didn't correct him. Didn't tell him what I actually did. Didn't mention the 6 properties or the flagship, or any of the 14 years it had taken to build what he was casually, confidently underestimating in real time. Partly because it wasn't the place. Partly because some old habit in me still equated silence with dignity, even when dignity was exactly what was being tested. Instead, I did what I have always done when someone hands me information about themselves without meaning to. I filed it away. Not for revenge, not yet, not even really as strategy. Just as fact. Walter needed an audience to feel secure in a room, and Margaret had learned to keep him comfortable, and neither of them had any idea yet what room we were actually standing in. The cake was wheeled out around 9. 3 tiers, white on white. The kind of cake that exists mostly to be photographed. Margaret and Walter stood behind it for the ceremonial cutting, and someone had decided, at some point in the planning, that there should be a light-hearted moment where they each fed a bite to someone in the crowd. A small piece of theater, borrowed from wedding tradition and repurposed for an engagement party, that seemed determined to feel like a wedding in every way except the actual one. Walter called me up. He said it warmly, publicly, my name carrying across the room with the kind of showmanship that meant it wasn't really for me. "Come on, Chris. Get up here. Don't be shy." And the crowd turned to look, and I understood, half a second too late, that whatever was about to happen had already been decided before I stood up. I walked over. He cut a piece, held it out on the small plate, and I remember thinking, in the last ordinary moment before it happened, that this was almost kind of him. Then his hand moved, not toward my mouth but past it, and the plate tilted, and the frosting met my face with a sound that seemed very loud in a room that had gone very quiet, and then very loud again, all at once, laughter breaking over the silence, like something released rather than something that had built. Phones were already up. I understood that, before I understood anything else, the small blue lights of a dozen screens, catching the moment from a dozen angles, already becoming something that would exist, independent of the room, independent of me. I straightened up slowly, frosting on my collar, on my jaw, in my eyelashes. I did not wipe it off immediately. I stood there for 1 full second longer than was comfortable, long enough to let the laughter find its natural ceiling and start to come down on its own. And in that second, I looked at Margaret, who was laughing too, a hand half raised to her mouth, in a gesture that might have been embarrassment, or might have been delight, and I couldn't tell which, and some old part of me noted that I used to be able to tell which. I reached for the napkin at the corner of the head table, not the one stacked by the gift table, this one, folded, embroidered, exactly where it had been placed. I wiped my face without hurry. I set the napkin down. I said nothing. Then I walked toward the back of the ballroom, past the bar, past a woman filming with her phone held sideways, and out through the service hallway that most guests never noticed was there, because I was one of the very few people in that room who knew exactly where it led. The service hallway was cooler than the ballroom, quieter in the specific way those corridors always are, all the noise of a party reduced to a low hum on the other side of a door. I stood there for a moment with frosting still drying at my hairline, catching my breath in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. A door opened further down the hall, and a young woman in the hotel's uniform came through it, carrying a tray of glassware, and she stopped when she saw me. The particular kind of stop that happens when someone recognizes a face they weren't expecting to see, in a place they weren't expecting to see it. "Mr. Johnson," she said, and then, quickly, "Are you all right? Do you need anything?" And I told her I was fine, just needed a minute, and she nodded but didn't quite leave, hovering the way people do when they sense something is wrong but can't identify what. I hadn't realized how loud my own name would sound in that hallway until it was said out loud by someone who knew what it meant. 2 other staff passed in the next few minutes, both of them offering some version of the same greeting, quieter than they might have otherwise, the kind of respectful quiet reserved for people who sign off on things. One of them asked if I wanted the ballroom's air conditioning adjusted, as though that had been the problem, and I said no, and thanked her, and stayed where I was. What I hadn't accounted for was the guest who'd followed me partway down the hall, drink in hand, looking for the restroom, or maybe just looking for me. I never found out which. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to hear the second staff member say Mr. Johnson again, this time attaching something to it, a title I hadn't used at the party and wouldn't have volunteered, and I watched her expression do something complicated, a small furrow, a recalculation happening somewhere behind her eyes. She didn't say anything to me. She turned and went back toward the ballroom, and I assumed, correctly as it turned out, that she would say something to someone else instead. I gave it another minute before I followed her back in, face cleaned, collar wiped as best I could manage, and re-entered a room that hadn't changed on the surface. Still loud, still bright, still moving toward whatever came after cake. But I noticed, in the first 30 seconds back inside, 2 or 3 faces that hadn't been paying attention to me all evening suddenly were, watching me cross the room with an expression I recognized from years of walking through my own properties unannounced. Not recognition exactly, just the early, uncertain shape of a question they hadn't decided yet whether to ask. I left the party about 40 minutes after the cake, quietly, without finding Margaret to say goodbye, because I didn't think either of us needed that particular conversation that night. I drove home with the windows down, even though it was cold, some old instinct telling me the air might help with something, though I couldn't have said what. I want to be honest about the 2 weeks that followed, because it would be easy to imagine them as a kind of waiting, a man sharpening something in the background, while the world assumed nothing was happening. That wasn't what it was. I went back to work the following Monday and did the things I usually do. Walked 2 of the smaller properties, sat through a budget meeting about a renovation in Ohio that was running slightly over schedule, ate lunch at my desk more often than I should have. Nobody at the office asked about the party, because nobody at the office knew there had been one. That was a different part of my life, filed somewhere separate, the way most people keep their families separate from their work, until the 2 are forced into the same room. Margaret texted twice. The first, 2 days after, said only that she was sorry about the cake, that Walter could be like that sometimes, that she hoped I wasn't upset. I read it 3 times and answered once, briefly, that I was fine, which was true in the way that answer usually is, technically accurate and not the whole picture. The second text, a week later, asked if I wanted to get the storage unit sorted finally, now that things had settled, and I said I'd look at my schedule, and then didn't, not yet. I didn't hear from Walter at all, which didn't surprise me. Men like that rarely follow up on the moments where they've been careless, mostly because they don't experience them as careless. To him, I suspected, the cake had already folded itself into the evening's general good humor, one more bit of momentum in a party that had otherwise gone well for him. If you're waiting for the part where I did something, made a call, pulled a file, set something quietly in motion, it didn't happen, not in those 2 weeks. I want to be clear about that, because it would be a more satisfying story if it had, and satisfying is not always the same as true. I simply lived my life. I answered emails. I approved a new uniform vendor for the flagship. I had dinner with my mother on a Sunday and didn't mention the party at all, because there didn't seem to be anything worth saying yet. Nothing had resolved. Nothing had escalated. It would have been reasonable, watching from the outside, to assume the story was already over. It came up the way most things come up in that job, sideways, inside a conversation about something else entirely. I was reviewing the following month's events calendar with Renata, who ran bookings for the flagship, and had a memory for names that occasionally caught things before I did, and she paused on an entry and asked, almost as an aside, if I'd seen the Bratton Hale pitch on the 17th. I hadn't. I asked what it was. Investor presentation, she said. Private equity group. 12 or so attendees, catering for 20 just in case. She scrolled to the contact name and read it out, and I recognized it before she finished the sentence, because it was the same name that had been announced at a cake cutting 2 weeks earlier, with a warmth designed to be watched. She caught something in my face, I think, because she asked, carefully, if there was a problem with the booking, if I wanted it moved to another property, or handed off to a different date, phrased in the neutral way she phrased everything, giving me room to say yes, without having to explain why. I sat with the question longer than it probably needed. There was a version of the next few weeks where I said yes, quietly closed the room to him, let him find out through some administrative apology that the date was no longer available, and never had to think about it again. It would have been easy. It would have been, in its own small way, satisfying. I told her no, leave it exactly as it is. She nodded, the way people nod when they've decided not to ask the second question, and moved on to the next line item, and I let her, because I didn't fully have the answer to that second question myself yet. What I knew was this: the room didn't belong to my history with Walter. It belonged to whatever it was built to do, which was host events correctly, competently, for whoever walked in the door with a deposit and a contract, regardless of what they'd done to me at a party 2 weeks earlier with a piece of cake and an audience. If I moved his booking, I would be making a decision about Walter because of who he was to me personally. That wasn't a decision I had any interest in making, not because I owed him anything, because I owed the business a version of myself that didn't let personal history rearrange operational decisions, and I had built the whole of what I had on exactly that discipline. So I let it stand. I told Renata to run it the way she'd run any other booking, full service, no adjustments, and went back to the rest of the calendar, aware, in some quiet corner of my thinking, that Walter was about to walk into a room he had no idea he needed my permission to be standing in. I hadn't planned to be in the building that afternoon, not for his meeting specifically. I had a walkthrough scheduled with the chief engineer to look at a ventilation issue on the 4th floor, the kind of routine check I still did myself when I could, mostly because I trusted my own eyes over a report. It put me near the ballroom corridor around 2, which was when Walter's pitch was already underway behind closed doors that weren't quite soundproof enough. I wasn't listening deliberately, but I caught pieces of it as I passed, his voice carrying in the particular register menus when they're trying to sound larger than the number of people actually in the room, and one phrase stopped me mid-step before I'd decided to stop at all. He was telling them, with total confidence, that the venue's ownership group was personally invested in the kind of partnership he was proposing, that this wasn't just a location, it was a relationship, that doors would open because of who he knew here. It wasn't true. I had never met him professionally in my life until 3 weeks ago, over a cake. I should have kept walking. I nearly did, but the engineer needed me to sign off on something in the anteroom adjacent to the ballroom, and so I stepped in through the side door, quietly, meaning to be in and out in under a minute, unnoticed. I wasn't unnoticed. One of the men at the table, older, grey at the temples, glanced up as I came in and did something I hadn't anticipated at all. His face opened into recognition, and he said my name, out loud, warmly, the way you greet someone you've done real business with before, because we had, years earlier, on an entirely unrelated renovation project, 2 properties away. "Chris Johnson," he said, standing halfway out of his chair. "Good to see you. Didn't know you'd be involved in this one." The room went quiet, in a way I recognized from another room, 3 weeks earlier, except the quiet moved in the opposite direction this time. Walter's expression did the thing I imagine mine must have done at the cake table, a half-second of not understanding, followed by the visible effort of trying to fold new information into an old story, fast enough that nobody noticed the seam. I said only that I appreciated it, that I wouldn't interrupt further, and excused myself back out the side door within the minute I'd promised the engineer. I didn't explain who I was to the rest of the table. I didn't need to. I had watched enough rooms in my life to know that the question was already loose in it now, and questions like that, once loose, tend to find their own way to an answer. I heard how the rest of it went second-hand, from the same investor, a week later, over a call about something unrelated. He mentioned it almost in passing, the way people mention things that were more interesting to them than they realized at the time. He said that after I'd left, he'd asked Walter a simple follow-up question, something about the nature of the relationship he'd described, how exactly the ownership group was structured into the deal he was proposing. Not a hostile question, just a natural one, the kind any competent investor asks before signing anything. Walter hadn't been able to answer it, not convincingly. He'd reached for the same warmth he'd used earlier, the same confident vagueness, and this time it hadn't landed, because the room had already recalibrated what it was listening to. The investor said it politely, almost kindly, that they'd decided to pass for now, that the numbers were fine, but something about the pitch hadn't held together the way it needed to. I didn't feel triumph hearing it. I want to be honest about that, because it would be a cleaner ending if I had. What I felt was something closer to recognition, the same feeling I'd had watching Margaret laugh at the cake table, of seeing a pattern complete itself without my help. I drove home that evening the long way, no particular reason, just wanting the extra 20 minutes of quiet. My mother, Ruth Elaine, was still up when I got in, sitting in the kitchen with the radio low, the way she often was on the nights I stopped by unannounced. She asked how my week had been, and I told her, in pieces, about the party, the cake, the pitch, the investor's call, laying it out the way you lay out something you're still trying to understand yourself. She listened without interrupting, the way she always has. When I finished, she didn't ask if I felt vindicated, or whether Walter had gotten what he deserved, or any of the questions I'd half expected. She asked instead why I'd gone to that party in the first place, when I'd already told her, weeks earlier, that I didn't need anything from that part of my life anymore. I didn't have a fast answer. I sat with it, and she let me sit with it, and eventually I said something about wanting to see for myself. She nodded slowly, and said that maybe that was the real habit worth breaking. Not the silence, not the restraint, but the part of me that still needed to go looking for proof, in rooms full of people who had never really been watching me at all. I thought about that most of the drive home the following morning, and for a long time after. It was, I think, the only part of the whole story that actually changed me. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's story, hit subscribe button. Thanks for your support.